G'day everyone, how you going? Today's date is the 10th of June, so they say, and it's 4:30 a.m. in the morning as usual, can't sleep. But anyway, hey, check this out of stolen history. Alright, there's some really cool information in here. Alright, I'll leave the links in the description for you. To most, the pressing problem of man today is the loss of meaning. Meaning is rooted in the past. When knowledge often fades, so does the meaning of life. Today's man does not know where he comes from, who he is, and where he is going. He has become a pawn in the hands of the powers that can direct him at will. Uprooted from his past, there is no foundation, and without a foundation based on reality, there is no way to develop an objective understanding of the world. The only way back to one's root gives meanings back to life. Epigenetics, the study of heritable changes in the gene expression that are not directly encoded in our DNA, suggests that our life experiences, such as hardship, traumatic experiences, etc., are passed on to subsequent generations. Now, that has been proved. They did a study with the Aboriginals here in Australia with the stolen generation, and the trauma has come through. Mythological and religious traditions go through further and even speak of collective memory. Already in the Vedas, the holy scripture of Hinduism, a kind of universal memory is mentioned. The Sanskrit word of Ashkisha stands for heaven, space, or ether, and according to the Eastern wisdom tradition, refers to the most stable of the five elements from which everything else was created. And it's been removed from us. Like they say we only have four elements now, but the ether is the fifth element. Thus, according to Indian mythology, all thoughts that have ever been thought and all deeds that have ever been performed are stored in this information field, which is also expressed in the legendary palm leaf in the libraries of Sri Lanka, India and Sri Lanka. The concept of a world memory also exists in the Occidental culture. We can find similar references in the Bible. For example, when the book of Isaiah speaks of a memory book, we can assume that all experience and our ancestors still exist in an energy field invisible to us. Until around 100 years ago, the ether was still a standard concept in the physics to explain the properties of invisible space. And even if today we are largely disconnected from our past, the experiences have not disappeared, but are only buried. Accordingly, it must be possible for us to reconnect with our past if we lift the veil and allow our memories to surface again. In order to access our collective memories, a collective effort is required to a certain degree, and an individual alone is not able to break through the amnesia. There are images that are strongly charged with the meaning that people are inexplicably drawn to them. The world's religions draw some extent on such images, albeit in extremely destructive ways. Myths and fairy tales also contain such images. The more the myth has changed with the meaning, the more important was its role in our past. By the radiance of the myth, we can already recognize its importance for mankind. If we allow it, let ourselves be touched by it, for example, the flood has buried itself into our collective memory, but so have stories of giants, dragons, and miraculous witches. The more we humans abandon these mythical images, the more we alienate ourselves from our own past and thus our own being. The process and thus of self-annihilation begins with the so-called Age of Enlightenment. Emmanuel Velikovsky writes, amnesia is one of the defense reactions of man. We know the effects of battle shock on shoulders. In the older Greek authors, the Pythagoreans and the Stoics, you'll find definite statements indicating catastrophes which occurred in the history of the human race and in the history of our Earth were not abnormal events. They were actually dominant, repeating themselves again and again. But from our historical records, we see knowledge of catastrophes disappearing slowly into oblivion. Plato described catalysms in several works. He wrote about the worlds destroyed and rebuilt. In his Timaeus, he noted that the Greeks do not remember ancient catastrophes besides the deluge. He adds that people of his time, as the priests and the stars told Solon, were unable to remember these catastrophe events. In another work, whose authorship is possibly wrongly ascribed to Plato, he is presented as believing in a peaceful universe. Plato's pupil, Aristotle, refused to believe in catastrophes. The scholarly world has accepted Aristotle's view that the planets can never change their motions. He, more than anyone else, is responsible for continuing the belief we live in a safe world on a planet to which nothing like collisions can happen. Aristotle argued that those who believe in celestial catastrophes should be brought to trial and convicted and punished by death. Because of man's aversion to knowing his past, science has greatly retarded pretending and reality to be as the truth. The Darwinian revolution was also a regression, disturbingly evident, was ignored. It was as if he worked with closed eyes, and Darwin proposed that only the fittest survive. His notebooks from the only field trip he ever undertook certain descriptions of a catalytic disruptions, he wrote that nothing less than a shaking of the entire frame of the earth could result in the mass annihilation of all life forms that he observed. Darwin did not accept the implications of the evidence that he saw with his own eyes. The Darwinian revolution was the rebirth of Aristotle, whose ideas had lost ground, if not at the time of Renaissance, then at the age of Enlightenment. Even in the age of Enlightenment, man espoused ideas of a peaceful earth. In recent centuries, great efforts have been made to make us humans forget where we come from and who we are. The destruction of the old knowledge of physics and biology was particularly powerful in uprooting us. Einstein and Darwin represent the inversion of the old knowledge to a nihilistic worldview. With man and meaningless, random something adrift in the endless and cold universe, these anti-life models about reality were perfected only recently in the 19th century and could even fully prevail only in the 20th century. Too great was the resistance even in the academic circles of the earliest 20th century. The so-called Big Bang Theory is a good example to understand how religious historic concepts entered science. The Belgian Jesuit and priest George Lemaitre created the Big Bang Theory, not on the basis of scientific facts, but on the basis of religious convictions, a notion of primordial or cosmetic seed from which everything evolved. And at the time, the Jesuits were given the task of embedding the myths and the origins of the world of the scientific-sounding framework. A few decades later, in 1951, the Pontifical Academy, which is the popes of science, accepted the Big Bang Theory, which they Jesuits. This long wait for the Pope's acceptance was not due to the opposition from the church, but the general public. After all, the Big Bang Theory has originated from the hands of Vatican itself. Ironically, the irrational Big Bang Theory is still part of our modern worldview, and there's still no single proof that it has ever been presented. The nihilistic and mechanistic worldview represented by Rousseau and other so-called masterminds of the Enlightenment could only flourish on the breeding ground of an industrialization. After all, industrialization turned man into a mechanical being who was reduced to material aspects. Industrialization must be seen as a turning point and the most notable event that is still comprehensible and visible to us today. As a result of a reset in the 18th or the 19th century, this reset followed an event that also brought about the so-called mud flood. All over the world, the buildings of the old world were partially submerged in earth, and the former first floors were thus converted into cellars. Little is known about the cause of the mud flood, possibly a world war we don't even remember or an electromagnetic plasma event. Velitrosky again on this. C.C. Jung became rather convinced that the unconscious mind, whether by telepathy or in some other way, is a common possession of the entire human race, but it's not only constituted in the experience of this generation who we interact with in the world today. It includes the cumulative experiences of all generations past. This is more than just telepathy, but something which is brought down from generation to generation. The fact that the catastrophic events have taken place, not just in a cave here or a cave there, but evidence of indescribable violence, such that no human being who succeeded to survive could flee from the traumatic events. Traumatic effects, as I say, indescribable. Imagine suddenly time is no more time. The day does not move into night. The ocean, it does not just beat at the coast of the Atlantic. It moves over the continent. Not even moves over the continent. Continent and sea just change places. Where the plains and the mountains are thrust up in a matter of hours, the air is filling with loud hissing noises, meteorites falling down, and all volcanoes erupting simultaneously. Not just the volcanoes that existed, but thousands of new volcanoes coming up and blazing, and rivers losing their beds, and earthquakes removing cities from their foundations. The human history starts with an intervention of writing. It's hardly 5,000 years old. Any one of you who have reached the age of 25 lived a full 0.5% of the recorded history. Before I finish, I will read you a letter from one of my readers. I feel that the ancients and the myth, epic and sacred works have been trying to tell us something about a problem that bothered them a great deal. It appears fairly clear that our ancestors were trying to communicate a deep fear, a terrible anxiety. They were talking about a problem that was so terrible and that the most drastic measures to the group discipline and or self-repossession were justified. It was a powerful fear. It is sometimes suggested that the Bible can directly be applied to modern life, and all the ancients were really writing about what was the problems of survival while avoiding neurosis, worries, unhappiness, and so on. To me, that approach is very unconvincing. The God these people were writing about was terrifying. In the Old Testament, he is the God of wrath. And in the New Testament, as Albert Schweitzer, among others, has pointed out, he is about to end the world in Jesus' lifetime shortly thereafter. He was dangerous, violent, rock, fire, flood, hurricane, and similar weapons he used on those he judged ill of. That's what the ancients wrote, and I see no point in trying to water it down. That's what they meant. They were really scared. According to biologist Rupert Sheldrake, collective memory is inherent to nature. Living systems have a collective memory of all past experiences of the entire species. This memory exists in an invisible but real energy field. Our collective memories are still there, but since the dawn of modern intrigue, they break through the supposedly fictionist stories, e.g. in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings universe. Tolkien wrote down his story, rooted in Germanic mythology, during the First War, at exactly the time that been recognized as the final destruction of the old magical world. World War I marked the beginning of civilization descent into soulless modernity. I think World War I was actually World War II. I think there was a great big war in the 1800s. Perhaps Tolkien had to write down his own vision of Middle-earth because the human psyche cannot survive without our connection to reality. Even if this connection is maintained by supposedly fictional stories, it is interesting to note that this context, that the fantasy stories are also an invention in the industrial age. It was only around 1850s that fictional novels become suitable for mass consumption. Could it be that people were not interested in immersing themselves into dissociative worlds at all, as long as life itself was full of meaning and conveyed with a higher purpose? The more hostile and cold our society becomes, the stronger becomes the urge to escape into imaginary worlds. And as these imaginary worlds are fed by our collective memories, it is this repossessed energy which breathes life into them, with the destruction of religions by so-called science founded by secret societies. People were deprived of one of the last connections to the path, but the truth wants to come to light again, and it will eventually resurface. Enormous efforts are being made to keep humanity asleep because of our potential, and true power is almost limitless, and that's so true. You want to know what the highest frequency a human produces and what word it produces and what action does it? It's honesty. Being truthful and being honest in every action you do, and you will shine and flourish. Industrialization. During the course of the industrialization during the 19th century, far-reaching social changes occurred in the Western world. The extent of these changes had not yet been adequately understood. Aspects such as rural flight, mass improvement, orphanages, lack of hygiene in the cities, and related to epidemics are known in the historical research. But these are only effects of the Industrial Revolution. A more elusive topic has been the question of what caused the massive technology upheavals of the 19th century. So far, the two most important questions have not been answered sufficiently. Why did the Industrial Revolution begin in England, and why precisely around 1800? If you break it down its essence, the Industrial Revolution consisted of groundbreaking technological inventions that permanently changed social life and enabled increasing automation of production. In particular, the development of the steam engine supposedly laid the foundation for the further development of electrical and internal combustion engine, which forms the foundation of today's society. But steam engines, like I know, go back before Jesus. Like, steam engines have been around for a long time. The Industrial Revolution presents us with a conundrum. In the terms of the official narrative, humanity bumbled along the low state of development for thousands of years, only to suddenly undergo a massive leap in development within a few decades without any external cause. To make matters even more absurd, since the end of the Industrial Age, mankind has again found itself in a period of technological stagnation. The supposed inventive spirit of the Central Europe, Germany in particular, with which historians say made industrialization possible, seems to have vanished. The role of the United Kingdom is central to understand what really behind the so-called Industrial Revolution. Historical research has commonly believed that in the Industrial Revolution began early in the mid-18th century, around 1760. In fact, however, little evidence can be found to support this claim. According to various historians, Cameron, Adams, Mikulski, there is no evidence of industrialization in contemporary literature as late as 1830. But we must assume that the ruling forces backdated the course of the Industrial Revolution in order to somewhat diffuse its explosive character. In fact, the new technological knowledge was unleashed on humanity within a few decades by a small elite, operating primarily out of Rome, Vatican, Venice, London, Washington. The true Industrial Revolution comes to what is commonly referred to in research as the Second Industrial Revolution. The phase of rapid industrialization began in 1860. What has been sold to us as an inventions was, in all likelihood, controlled release of technologies that were widely available and powered by free energy before the reset. Free in the sense that everyone had direct access to the energy source. Only this time the difference was the technology was tied to scarce, hard-to-get resources, allowing the ruling powers to gain monopoly on the production of the goods. Since the Industrial Revolution, the worldwide generation and production of wealth has been controlled by a small group. Along with the control of the fiat money system through the central banks, the scarcity of energy has been the most important element in controlling the masses. This process is reflected, for example, in conflict between Tesla or Edison and Tesla. Tesla defended the historic model of the old world, thinking in terms of energy, frequencies, and vibration, and did not want energy production to end up in the hands of a few. When industrialists, first of all J.P. Morgan, who at the time were responsible for building the energy monopolies, realized that Tesla's work was not suitable for the oppression of humanity, and he was marginalized into an oblivion. In reality, the Industrial Revolution did not take place until well after the 1830. We are talking about a period of 50 years, roughly 1850 to 1900, during which the old knowledge was reintroduced in a modified form. Not coincidentally, the first World Major Fair was held in London in 1851. Imperialism. Why did the Industrial Revolution begin in England? Historians are in the dark, but the single deciding factor that set the British Empire British Empire, apart from all the other countries at the time, was colonialism and imperialism. The British Crown controlled a large part of the so-called New World. And the Crown, of course, stole not only labour and goods, as historians like to portray, but the remaining knowledge from before the reset as well. And knowledge includes technologies. Officially, much of India's knowledge has said to have been wiped out by genocide on the Indian scholars and a series of invasions. What's going on here? All right. Scholars and a series of invasions over the course of the last 1,200 years, but evidence suggests that it was British colonialism that significantly mutilated India's culture. Yes, it would have been. For example, one of the main activities in the Aristocratic Society of Bengal, officially founded in 1784 under the patronage of Warren Hastings, was to systematically collect and preserve ancient manuscripts of India, as well as inscriptions in stone and metal and icons and ancient coins. And Frederick Max Muller, one of the founders of the Western academic field of Indian studies, was paid by the East India Trading Company to translate the Vedas, to distort them permanently and to create arbitrary dates. Thus, on December 9th, 1867, he wrote to his wife, "I feel convinced, though I shall not live to see it, that this edition of mine and the translation of the Veda will hereafter tell the great extent of the fate of India and the growth of millions of souls in that country. It is the root of their religion, and it show them what the root is. I feel sure the only way of uprooting all that has sprung from it during this last 3,000 years." In a book titled The Truth About Us, The Politics of Information Society from Manu to Moro, Sanjay Kuchovsky shows the event of the current understanding of the caste system, which was developed only during the British colonial rule. At a time when colonial powers only information was absolute. Even in the pre-colonial written records and royal court documents and travelogues studied by professional historians and philosophers such as Nicholas Dirks, G.S. Scrooge, Richard Eaton, David Shulman, and Cynthia Talbot make little or no mention of the caste system. But back in the United Kingdom, for India has been called the jewel in the crown for a good reason. Michelle Gibson, Piercing the Veil of Illusion, writes, European colonialism intentionally creates divide over the entire landmass of the earth, creating new countries from lands that were taken, as well as divisions and discords between people that originally existed in harmony worldwide. It also diagrams the means by which power and control were consolidated worldwide, mostly stating out as trading companies that ended up being very powerful in their respective regions. And after gaining complete control, transferring power and control of the regions to their respective European empires. India was called the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, and it's the largest and most important overseas possession. Much of British Empire was built around India in order to provide the roots to and protection for India. India was a prosperous, rich, in spices, silk, indigo, gold, cotton, other products and resources. Trade with an eventual political dominance of large parts of India, what was provided Britain with large parts of wealth in the 1700s through to the 1900s. We can imagine that before the reset, the European countries had embassies in India and that they lived lively cultural exchange of values and goods, which collapsed only in the wake of the cataclysmic events. A new European elite took advantage of the power vacuum created by the collapse of the vantage civilizations and transformed the formerly existing trade structures into all-consuming power apparatuses. This would also explain the inconsistencies for historical research has never been able to explain satisfactorily why the colonial powers only began to expand their rule over the colonies with brute force and blind missionary zeal for a few hundred years after colonization. The so-called high imperialism began in the 1850s with the suppression of Indian Rebellion of 1857, considered a key event. In 1885, the Congo Conference held in Berlin at Bismarck's invitation settled the effective division of Africa among the colonial powers. And at the Congo Conference, the concept of the state of formation was applied to Africa and imposed the continent, but thinking in terms of state boundaries and national identities was still fairly new in Europe as well. In 1884, the Washington Agreement enforced the worldwide time system, according to the Greenwich Mean Time, which had been introduced by the British Empire in 1847. The role of the German Empire in relation to the imperialism was primarily to denounce human rights violations, to establish legal foundations, and to keep in check the colonial superpowers that were committing inconceivable atrocities in the colonies. However, in the course of falsifying history after World War II, German imperialism is nowadays usually portrayed in a negative light. Based on this lie, the German colonies were divided among the other colonial powers after World War I. To outline the research of colonialism expert Bruce Gilley, German East Africa, a German prefectorate, was a complete success. The Germans brought peace to Africa, and they successfully put down the Maenai Rebellion from 1905 to 1907, and reforms after 1907 ushered in an era of progress, workers' rights for natives, an end to forced labour, prohibition of slavery, compulsory education, where German achievements eclipsed all other colonial powers. The Germans were extremely popular in East Africa. This is why World War I lasted so long in East Africa, because the native fighters were so devoted to the German Empire that they will continue to fight until after the bitter end of the fall of 1918. Since 1907, there were councils for interests of the Africans, a decentralized administration, and the administrative schools for local elite. Harry Rudin wrote, the comment often heard about the Germans, which were always strict, sometimes harsh, but always just. An interesting note about the German political power period in Africa is that it was a German physicist, Robert Koch, who found a cure for sleeping sickness, which was then stolen by the French and used throughout the country starting in the 1920s. Heinrich Schein, the last German governor of East Africa, coined the term colonial guilt lie in the face of the British lies. Most of the official history of colonialism between the 1500s and 1800s is probably largely fabricated, which includes the notion that the Spanish were responsible for the impressive South American architecture, or the British rebuilt India from the ground up. This is all a lie. Instead, somewhere between the 1700s and 1850, a worldwide catalysm occurred, which, by the unified culture, broke apart, and most knowledge about free energy and high culture was lost. People were collectively thrown into the dark age, in which they began to focus on survival and experienced a period of suffering and deprivation. Now, dominant power elite, upon the coming of power, reintroduced some parts of the old knowledge to change society in a way that suited them. This time period is known as the Industrial Age. This power elite has its roots in the Roman Empire. The countries of the Western Roman Empire gradually become a huge economic and warlike nations. Italy, Venice, Portugal, Spain, France, Britain, Netherlands. The first financial centre was established in Venice, which was later moved to Switzerland. All of those who did not want to submit to the church were killed or fled towards Germania. The approach of the church corresponds to the tactics of the Roman conquest. The church then divided the territory and set up its own administrators in the areas. The subsequent emergence of the high nobility, all of them loyal to the church, can attribute to this. The Roman army was at one point dissolved and divided into knightly orders. Germany, a stronghold of Protestantism, was able to resist these ecclesiastical forces a little longer, but also taken over some point, as the Muscovite Tartary, the former empire of the Scythians, which was taken over by Russia. Since then, the European powers have all been controlled from behind the scenes by a cable. They managed to make it look like Britain, Germany, France, Portugal, Spain, Russia were competing with each other, but they were actually working together. That's true, because all the Queen's grandchildren were married and placed into those places, you know? So... So, where are we up to? Sorry. So, the heart of darkness lay in Western Europe. It was a race against time, for most of the world was just recovering from the reset. And all the Europeans had to do was get a few of their people on ships and get them quickly to rebuild kingdoms, kill or expel or manipulate the rulers, and proclaim a new political system. The Japanese Seclusion Edict, reportedly from 1636, stated the following: "No Japanese ship, nor any native of Japan, shall presume go out of the country. Whoever acts contrary to this shall die, and the ship with the crew and the goods aboard shall be sequestered until further orders. All person who return from abroad shall be put to death. Whoever discovers a Christian priest shall have a reward of 400 to 500 sheets of silver, and for every Christian in proportion. All Nambian, Portuguese, and Spanish who propagate the doctrine of the Catholics or bear the scandalous name shall be imprisoned in the Ora or the common jail in the town. The whole race of the Portuguese, with their mothers, nurses, or whatever belongs to them, shall be banished to Mako. Whoever presumes to bring a letter from abroad or to return after he has been banished shall die with his family. Also, whoever presumes to intercede for him shall be put to death. No nobleman or any soldier shall be suffered to purchase anything from a foreigner." Thus began the social approach in Japan known today as Seku, the voluntary isolation of Japan from all Western powers. It was not until 1853, 2 years after the First World's Fair in London, that the West actually succeeded in turning Japan away from its peaceful, self-sufficient life. The policy of Seku ended in 1853. The American black ships commanded by Matthew Perry forced the opening of Japan to America. And this was just a few years after the same forces had destroyed ancient China in what is now known as the Opium Wars. In 1842, the Qing dynasty was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanking, which is Hong Kong. This is the first of what Chinese later called unequal treaties, which granted Britain compensation and extraterritorially opened up 5 entry ports to foreign merchants and ceded Hong Kong Island to the British Empire. The failure of the treaty to fulfill British goals of improved trade and diplomatic relations led to the Second Opium War of 1856-60, and the defeat of the Qing led to social unrest within China. In China, the war is considered the beginning of the modern Chinese history. The same old game over and over again. It is important to realize that everyone in China and Japan hated Catholics because Catholicism was used as a weapon to weaken their countries culturally before the British also took over the political structures until 1840s. China and Japan were defending themselves quite successfully even back then. Vatican-controlled Catholicism had nothing to do with genuine Christianity. Rather, the Vatican used to infiltrate genuine Christianity. Michelle Gibson. The year of 1493 was the year the Pope Alexander authorized land grab of Americas in the Interceda papal bull. This papal bull became a major document in the development of subsequent legal doctrines regarding the claims of the Empire of the New World, and assigned to Castile in Spain the exclusive rights to acquire territory to trade in and even approach the lands lying west of the Mediterranean, suited 100 leagues west of the Azores, Cape Verde Islands, except for any lands actually possessed by any other Christian prince beyond the Mediterranean prior to Christmas 1492. The Emperor of the Roman Church became the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. The famous papal bull Unum Sanctum, supposedly dating back to the Middle Ages, was intended to cement the absolute rule of the Pope. The last sentence of the bull reads, "But we now declare and define that it is absolutely necessary for salvation for every human creature to be subject to the Roman pontiff." Thus, the Pope legitimized himself as the sole representative of God on earth. The so-called heretical Christian communities, such as the Albigenses, the Cathars, condemned the papacy as the church of the Antichrist and considered themselves the successors of the true Christian heritage, which, however, was allowed to continue only in secret. The papal Catholics were accused, among other things, of being responsible for mysterious fires that destroyed entire cities. The monument in the city of London about the London Fire of 1666 still reared until 1830. Most terrible destruction of the city began and carried out by the treachery of the wickedness of the papal faction. Western historians confused Jesuit Catholicism with Christianity and accused Japan and China of blindly hating all Christians, while omitting all the facts and proving the obvious interference of the Jesuits in the Catholic Church in foreign affairs, thus reshaping the Chinese chronological. We read the following Uwe Topper, the Great 480 event. Perhaps the most lasting effect of the Jesuit work, however, lay in reshaping the Chinese chronology and its alignment with Western data. The creation of chronological system was quite new for the Chinese. It was done according to the Latin model and the whole and spirit of the Catholic Church. The whole process took a century and a half and was finally terminated by the Chinese from 1735 by force as a result of the immense work. The first completed work of the Chinese history appeared in 1778. Something that has never been done before in China. These were not only the dynasties, the orders of the emperors and the dates in reign, but also the transfer of the dates to the European timescale. Though the errors in its are always criticised, the work has not become obsolete to this day, but has remained in principle the guide of our sinologists, even if they should no longer be aware of it. With the rewriting of the chronology, the Jesuits laid the groundwork for the British takeover of China in 1842. Not only Christianity, but also Islam and Judaism were sooner or later used to control the masses. Because of the nature of the rewrite, we do not even know if the general timeline of the events prior to these wars in the name of imperialism is true. The timeline for many of the events around the world were artificially extended to give more credence to the idea of centuries-long process of colonialism and to distract from the fact that until reset, there was a unified civilization of multiple independent cultures that traded peacefully with each other. The supposedly new technological knowledge was introduced worldwide in the course of the 19th century. First and foremost, Western Europe and the Americas, an important role. The reintroduction of the old technologies in the new guise of energy scarcity was played by the world fairs. From 1851 onwards, countless world exhibitions were held. Today, this tradition still exists in the form of the expos, but still, in principle, they no longer play a role since there have been no real new technological breakthroughs since World War II. The exception of information technology, which has been deliberately developed to bring in the dystopian version of transhumanism to the world, it can be said that with World War I, not only classical architecture but innovation disappeared from the world. Before industrialization, there was only one form of sophistication architecture in the world, known today as historicism, a revival architecture, because according to the official narrative, virtually all of these buildings were created only in the 19th century, supposedly as a recourse in ancient Greco-Roman architectural trends, Neo-Gothic, Neo-Renaissance, Neo-Baroque. The basic principles of these buildings were the same, and their quality unrevived. It is the uniform architecture that indication of a unified civilization that only recently broke up into individual kingdoms of nation-states. Even in Japan, there were these Greco-Roman classical buildings before 1900, although Japan was still completely isolated from the outside world until around 1850. Even after that, after the British had forcibly conquered Japan, it was only slowly, hesitantly opened up to the West. The German chronological Christopher Pfizer wrote the book The Matrix of the Ancient History about the chronological culture dating of European building culture. Turned out that today's Occidental building culture, the emergence of today's medieval cities, date back to about 300 years before today. Before that, according to today's linguistic usage, at the beginning of the 18th century, there was still a culture in Europe that can be called Rome or other late Roman. In political sense, too, it seems there have been late Roman Empire in this. However, the political centre of the power shifted from Gaul to Germania. The collapse of the late Roman Empire was a fact. However, it cannot be said what causes were. Natural disasters, epidemics, political, economic, cultural factors are mentioned as triggers. The breakup of the old Roman power created the basis for the new modern culture. This was, in a sense, rebuilt on the basis of tabula rasa. There was a turning point of culture with apparently only a few connecting points to the former civilization. The cultural dynamic of Europe was expansive towards the outside, towards the west. The discovery and colonialization of the two Americas and then of Africa and Asia took place. The successful colonialization of the New World in East Asia saved Europe and gave it privileged position of the world colonial power from about the middle of the 18th century. The New Europe, which has merged in the first decades of the late 18th century, was invented the written language that has been preserved today, and thus the written culture, art, architecture too, were largely created only after the great political cultural break. In other words, colonialization of the old world did not take place until the 1700s at the earliest, but was backdated by the falsifiers of history on behalf of the imperial powers. Imperialism developed as a reaction to the event, possibly a war or a natural disaster which wiped out the old, so-called ancient world and left a power vacuum. Western Europe managed to emerge from this vacuum as a winner. Imperialism was a kind of worldwide raid by the Western European powers to grab the countries in the world that had been devastated by the catastrophes. The conflicts between the individual colonial powers, Spain, Portugal, England, Germany, etc., that have been handed down historically are part of the game of hide-and-seek played by the European power elite, organised in secret societies and shadow organisations. These conflicts took place only on a superficial political level because, as there is the case today, the public decision makers were rarely privy to the real plans. Now, let us look at the story of the two buildings. Penn Station, New York, built between 1904 and 1910, demolished in 1963 because the building was dirty and the maintenance costs could not allegedly be longer met. Built in the Greco-Roman style, Ada Louise Huxtable wrote New York Times, 1963. The tragedy is that our present age not only could not produce such a building, but could not even maintain it. Erie County Savings Building, built in 1893 in the Neo-Romanesque style. We read about the demolition of the Erie County Savings Bank in 1968 in the Buffalo Evening News. Every evening for more than 3 months, a battle was fought between Shelton Square, between her and the two Carnarvon cranes. The latter attacked the two primitive means of defence, a pair of jaws and a rock in a modern wrecker's parlance, a clumber bucket and a thrusting ball, the former weighing at 3 tons and the latter at 3.5. The fight was one of the toughest in a veteran wrecker's memory. For a wrecker to meet resistance is like a weightlifter confessing his muscles are getting flabby. It began at 4:30 in the afternoon and continued through 7:30 the next morning, 5 days a week. A crowd of a viable size would gather to see the kill. It was shown of the town. Whole families arrived in station wagons from the suburbs. The original plans of the building was made available. When the crane operations of the 25-man demolition crew began to mulch at the building, however, it was evident that plans and reality did not agree. The roof with its turrets and gargoyles and finials were the toughest. A final lifted intact like a birthday candle to the ground. It measured 3.5 feet and weighed an estimated 600 pounds. Not to mention the cones on the towers, which looked like cake frosting aloft, but on the ground measured 20 feet high and 15 feet across, cast iron and steel. As the wrecking progressed, scores of 200-pound red granite caved image, 5 feet thick, set in the walls around the crest of the building, came tumbling down. Their carnival faces of joy and sorrow biting the dust. The very stones of the building were resistant. The walls, which tapered from 9 feet to the base of 3 feet, were composed of foot-thick red granite stones weighing up to 3 tons each, interlocked, and they had been lifted up like lumps of sugar, piece by piece. They did not sound like sugar when they were dropped. What the fuck? Unreal. If we look at the bigger picture, the two worlds of wars appear in a new light. The colonialization of the world took place. I think I just read that. All right. If we look at the bigger picture, the two world wars appear in a new light. The colonialization of the old world took place later than we are told, only in the 1700s. By the early 1900s, most of the world was under control of European elite-controlled colonial powers, primarily England, France, Netherlands, Spain, Belgium, Portugal, Russia, Italy. These nations were already influenced by secret societies. Then, with the two world wars, European culture was largely destroyed. As a result, people were deprived of their ability to remember. The wars created a collective trauma that made it difficult to connect with the pre-war period. If we look at the earliest photographs from the former colonies, particularly India, we see the world in ruins and people who are not suited to the structures in which they live. These photos resemble the 18th and 19th century landscapes of Europe. If we ignore the official timeline for a moment, we can entertain the thought that our world laid in ruins not too long ago, and that the event allowed a parasitic force to establish a new world order. And this new order is still in the making, and it has a goal to complete the uprooting of man from its being and its history. The 19th century saw the conquest of the last part of the empire, the Tartary Empire by the Russian Empire. The independent or free Tartary, as it was called on the old maps, was located until about 1870 directly east of the Caspian Sea, in territory of today's Uzbekistan, with cities like Samarkand and Baku. However, Tartary is not mentioned in the official history of Uzbekistan. And Tony Fomenko writes, unlike Moscow Tartary, the fate of independent Tartary is known. It was conquered by the Romanovs in the middle of the 8th century. Smakala, and the capital of the independent Tartary, was seized by the Romanovs' army in 1868. So it's Samarkand, Samarkand is the name of the capital. A few decades later, the Soviets, on behalf of the cabal, destroyed large parts of Central Asia, remnants of the old world, in the name of communism. The first Anglo-Afghan War, the settlement of New Zealand and Australia, and the gold rush in the American West also fall within this period. Consequences of the industrialization. In 1839, John D. Rockefeller Sr. was born in the United States. He later founded the Standard Oil Company in 1870.